I'm here.
Okay.
The time now is 11:33 a.m. We are back on the video record.
So we were about to get into your opinion and the things that you did to look at that before we had to take a break. I do want to just state for the record that Mr. Siddle is a recent amputee, and from time to time, sometimes without warning, will need to take a break to adjust his prosthesis, allow the blood flow, things like that. And we both certainly appreciate the professional courtesy to allow him to do that. As it relates to your opinion, I believe we're going to talk about the steps you took, kind of the things that you reviewed and looked at in coming to that opinion. What was the first thing that you did?
The very first thing I did, sir, was get a copy of the charges or the report that details why Trooper Morgan was dismissed.
Okay.
And I have that in front of me here, or I have one of the documents in front of me, but I have what I consider a summary document from a Colonel Tracy Trott, with the subject of recommendation for disciplinary action. And I'm paraphrasing this.
I understand.
And the date is January 30th, 2012. And so I started by identifying what is it that the department looked at and why is it that they dismissed Trooper Morgan. After reviewing this, then I turned around and requested a copy of the dash cam report because that seems to be the best evidence that's available. Then I compared what I saw on the dash cam recording and in contrast to the department's position of what Trooper Morgan did and did not do.
Okay.
And so that right there is the core fundamental basis for my opinion, is looking at what are the charges, what's the basis of those charges, and in addition I looked at some of the subsequent research, or not the subsequent investigations that were done, and then kept going back to starting with the documentary evidence of the videotape, which I'll refer to as the dash cam tape.
Okay.
Then after I looked at the dash cam tape, then I turned around and looked at what is the department's training. So I requested and received a number of training documents regarding evasive or emergency service driving, emergency driving, pursuit driving, and in my discovery I found that there was documents that was disclosed by the state as far as the training curriculum, but there was also some documents that seemed to be missed in the process of discovery, because in one of my interviews with Trooper Morgan, he made reference to some additional training documentation that I did not receive. And so Trooper Morgan sent me those documents. And so in essence, I then turned around and looked at, is there a conflict between Trooper Morgan's, what I saw on the dash cam, with his training? And then the third phase is look at what is reasonable for a person to see or not see within 2 seconds based on the literature as it relates to the human factor literature, the visual literature, as well as specifically domain of law enforcement or anything high risk. So I came to the conclusion that Trooper Morgan, his behavior was reasonable. There was nothing unreasonable in the process. And in fact, I found a number of cases where what the commissioner, or what was in Colonel Tracy Trott's report for the reasons he used for terminating Trooper Morgan, either he was given evidence or opinions that were simply not true, or he was misled in some capacity, or there's some serious inconsistencies with his vision of facts compared to what the documentary evidence shows across the board.
Okay. And could you cite some of that, or give us some examples of that, of what you were able to reconcile?
I can, sir. Well, this is his, what I'll refer to as the termination notice. And I'll just give you a couple things. On page 2, and this is, again is from a memorandum from Colonel Tracy Trott. At the very first paragraph. I'm going to read this section and then I'll go back and give commentary to it. In the first paragraph, in the second full sentence, it says, "You can be heard on a video speaking out loud that you were going to sit in Andersonville Pike and Griffith Road for a minute, then go back to see if the silver vehicle had crashed due to the high speeds and the curvy road." Now, I went and listened to the video that you supplied me, and I did not hear any narrative of that context or of that specificity. It goes on to say, you did not turn to go back and check for a crash vehicle until a crash with injuries in the area was dispatched over the radio. You responded to the vehicle crash, and your camera showed that the crash was a silver vehicle off the roadway engulfed in flames. Now, my definition of engulfed and maybe the colonel's definition are two different things. I mean, the video clearly shows that the front end of the vehicle was on fire when Trooper Morgan first arrived, but the whole vehicle wasn't engulfed. But I'm not going to split hairs, but that's just my opinion. But it goes on to say, in the next sentence, the colonel says, "A large amount of debris can be seen in the video surrounding the burning vehicle. The area was lit by streetlights, and the burning car came to a final rest beside a tree sitting out in the open in a grass field near the edge of the roadway. You put in your incident report that the driver was still inside the vehicle and appeared to be deceased. You later determined that the silver car that was on fire must have been the silver car that you had been chasing. The driver of the silver car was later identified as Gordon Anito." So what the colonel does here is he lays down some foundation for his decision. He continues to say, "Sergeant Lowell Russell was responding to a supervisor and wrote in his incident report that he had watched the pursuit video while sitting in your car. Sergeant Russell stated in the report that while observing your video he saw," and this is in quotations, "the car off the right side of the road on fire and the rear tail lights on." Now, that sentence is clearly false. Either there's another piece of evidence out there that I haven't been exposed to, or there is some false memory here on the part of Sergeant Russell, or that's blatantly incorrect. It can only be one of three things. The report goes on to say, Sergeant Russell wrote, "The pursuit clearly shows Mr. Anito's vehicle was approximately 16 feet off the right side of the road on fire when Trooper Morgan drove by. The video does not show the vehicle was on fire." It's very clear. Again, unless there is something else that I haven't been exposed to, what the colonel wrote is truly false. It goes on to say, Sergeant Russell passed his concerns through the chain of command, and then Colonel Tracy Trott reviewed the video after being notified Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Springer of the incident. Colonel Trott observed on the video that there was smoke 20-25 feet in the air, that's in parentheses, that there appeared to be the beginning of a glow of fire from the interior of a car as you passed by the crash scene. Again, the evidence doesn't show any glow of any type. And that the debris field was wide and the car was severely damaged and smashed against the tree. The last sentence is equally disturbing because here the colonel is saying that the debris field is wide and the car is severely damaged and smashed against the tree. The debris field cannot be identified until Trooper Morgan drove back to the scene. In this particular case, the debris field was on the left-hand side of the crashed car when he again returned to the crash scene to investigate an accident. But what this paragraph insinuates is that as Trooper Morgan drove by in a space of 2 seconds or less, he was able to identify a debris field. You can't see the debris field except on the return. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is the colonel's making these assumptions based on, I believe, the same video we looked at. So, again, we have Sergeant Russell making incorrect or false statements. It appears that we have Colonel Trott making incorrect or false statements. And then we also appear to have Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Springer making incorrect or false statements. So this discrepancy can only be described one of two ways. There's another piece of evidence we haven't seen, and if that's the case and I look at it, then I can reverse my opinion. But based on the evidence I've been presented with, this paragraph is just blatantly wrong. But a man's life has been held accountable to it, and he has been terminated. You go into the third paragraph, we have more of the, quote, inconsistencies. If you go down halfway through the paragraph, I'm just going to give you kind of a marker. It says, there's a sentence about dead center. It says, you stated in your interview that you were specifically looking for tail lights on the vehicle you were chasing. Now, from my end, that would be an accurate statement. If you're in a pursuit, you're actually looking for the vehicle the target vehicle you're pursuing. In this particular case, Trooper Morgan had been exposed to the pursuing or the fleeing vehicle on 4 different occasions at a relatively constant distance. I believe I said in my earlier deposition that my best guess is probably a quarter mile. But if I go back and show the tape, which I can do and I'm prepared to do, I can show on 4 different occasions he had observation of the target fleeing vehicle, and it was approximately the same distance. So in each case, the distance was a quarter mile away. In this particular 2 seconds that we're evaluating conduct, it's reasonable for Trooper Morgan to come over the crest of a hill that's making a slow left turn and to be looking forward. And in fact, he says that, and it's consistent with Tennessee State Patrol's training. In the training program, it says, and I can pull up that evidence in a bit, but in the training outlines, it instructs troopers to look 12 seconds or more into the future, or 12 seconds forward when they're in a pursuit. So, but this sentence continues that says, I'm going to go back and reread it again. You stated in your interview that you were specifically looking for taillights on the vehicle you were chasing. Makes sense. That would be appropriate. The video clearly shows that when you came over the rise in the roadway, there was a vehicle sitting off to the right of the road with an illuminated rear taillight. That's not true. Nowhere on the evidence I looked at is an illuminated taillight. Now there's a flash of red, but there's no illuminated taillight. You said that you saw the vehicle out of the corner of your eye and dismissed it as a parked vehicle, not involved in an accident, but it was dark, way off the roadway, and not overturned. Those are reasonable assumptions. He's looking for a target vehicle that is fleeing him a quarter mile away. So when you come over the rise, he wouldn't necessarily be looking immediately to his right or left for a vehicle unless something captured his attention. Goes on to say, you are a trained and experienced state trooper. Colonel Trott traveled to the crash scene to personally view it and drove the road. The department considered what Colonel Trott observed at the crash scene, along with circumstantial evidence concerning your actions of not stopping for the crashed vehicle, and believes you saw or should have seen the crashed vehicle and did not stop for it. So in this particular case, what we're doing is trying to determine, was Trooper Morgan's missing what we now know is a crashed vehicle, but a vehicle that basically didn't pop out of the landscape for less than 2 seconds during a pursuit if his actions were reasonable. So here what the colonel's trying to do is say, this is what should be going on inside your mind. It's totally unreasonable from any perspective to believe that. So in this particular case, or in this particular document, we have 2.5 paragraphs of inconsistent and flawed assumptions that the Tennessee State Police made in terminating Trooper Morgan. So either there was bad intel that went to the leadership, there was flawed intel that went to the leadership, the intel or the documents or the opinions going to the leadership was falsified, or there's another piece of evidence out there that I have yet to see. And if there's another piece of evidence, I'd like to see it, because I could turn on a dime and say, it's obvious Trooper Morgan made a mistake. But everything I've seen so far, I don't see that. So my starting point was, this is where I start the investigation and drawing any type of reasonable assessment. Start with what are the charges that he was fired for and what are the accusations. Then I turn around and I look at the video and I break the video down. Now, as you might, just as a memory, when your staff called me and said, got a case you'd like for me to review, gave me a high-level overview, we're going to send you a videotape. And at that point, it was what I believe was the department's sanctioned videotape that Ms. Martins referred to. I looked at that videotape 6 times and couldn't determine where there was an accident or where there was a vehicle on fire. Finally, I ran it all the way to the end of the tape, and I admit, I was driving the route, and when Trooper Morgan stopped, I stopped the videotape. And I thought, okay, well, I missed a car on fire, so I hit replay 6 times. Didn't see it. When I finally went back and did what I should have done the first time, was run the tape start to end, is when I find a vehicle that's been crashed and it's starting to go on fire, and of course there's a tragedy with the loss of life of Mr. Anito. But in conjunction with that, to show you how easy it is to miss, just from looking at a videotape, I called my staff down, 3 of my staff members, had them each one individually look at the tape the same way I did, where the video started, and
Objection to hearsay.
where the video started and where Trooper Morgan stopped the first time, and nobody could find the vehicle that was on fire or a red tail light that was illuminated. So from a reason,
Excuse me, was my objection noted?
Yes, it was noted.
Okay.
so from a reasonable man's perspective, and I think I'm a reasonable person, it's clear that some of the assumptions that have been made in Colonel Tracy Trott's document are flawed, putting it kindly.
There's also a, term of art in law enforcement referred to as hindsight bias. Are you familiar with that term?
I am, sir.
Okay. And it speaks for itself. It seems fairly obvious what a bias is with benefit of hindsight, but if you could just, is there any different meaning to that other than its obvious meaning that?
Well, in the law enforcement instructor community, the term refers to events that are either high profile, have negative public consequences for an agency, and essentially a decision is made because of overreaction of what the public may or may not think. The context is an officer gets into some type of event, a shooting, a pursuit, something where his instantaneous decision making had to be made, and in hindsight, something bad happened, and so the department starts claiming human error, and they start trying to separate it. The view in the training world is that they're trying to absolve themselves of liability. But generally over time, as more evidence comes out, those type of events backfire.
After the video, and you've stated this, you did look at the training curriculum, correct?
Yes, sir.
And
Sorry.
We're going to go through that later, so we'll address that then. You also reviewed Trooper Morgan's statements that he gave in this matter, correct?
I did, sir.
And you also spoke with Mr. Morgan himself on more than one occasion.
Yes, sir. I believe I spoke to him 3 times total.
Okay. And were you able to glean some helpful information from an actual interview with Mr. Morgan about this case?
Well, my view is, in interviewing Trooper Morgan, is that I didn't hear anything in his statement that would lead me to believe that he would intentionally pass a vehicle that could have fatal consequences. I really believe he just didn't recognize it. Now, there's a chance that he saw the vehicle out of his peripheral vision, but he didn't recognize it as a crash vehicle. In fact, to that end, I went through the videotape and looked specifically at the number of times you pass a vehicle in a drive. And I believe my research, I got it written here someplace, but I believe that during the length of the pursuit, that you pass 4 vehicles that are off the side of the road. And I bet nobody's noticed that in their investigation. In addition, there's a certain number of vehicles that passed Trooper Morgan, not counting Mr. Anito's vehicle. The human mind is a wonderful thing, but memory and recognition, are almost instantaneous. Memory is about the gist. It's not about clear detail. If I asked you how you drove here this morning, and asked you about a specific landmark that you drove on the way here, and you passed a fairly large restaurant on your left-hand side called Farmer's Inn, but I bet you don't remember it. And I bet you don't remember the World War II tank that you passed on the right side had I not warned you ahead of time. So you were expecting to look for it as a road map or a landmark. That's the way memory works. Memory focuses on an experience of the moment. When you're looking for something, we look with our eyes, that's basically a vehicle, but we decipher, interpret, and recognize with the mind. So if the mind is not expecting to see something, you don't see it. It's referred to as either inattentional blindness, it's also referred to as focus blindness. The literature is abundant on this, absolutely abundant. And I believe it's actually referenced in some of the Tennessee State Patrol research at the same time. So in this particular case, in talking to Trooper Morgan, I heard nothing in his conversation that led me to believe he was being deceptive, that he was lying about not recognizing a vehicle that had crashed.
And then I believe you said that also you applied, again, the experience that your experience that we went through at the beginning of this deposition, and that is reflected in the first exhibit to your deposition. And with all of that, is it fair to say that you applied that to what is the reasonable performance capabilities within the domain of high risk and